Did you know that in Alberta, anyone of the age of 17 or older can donate blood, and that one blood donation can save up to 3 lives?
Hey everyone, this lesson is going to be on the structure and components of blood. So blood is known as a fluid tissue. So like other body tissues, blood's made up of cells working together for common purposes. And those two main purposes are the transport of materials as well as homeostatic regulation. So the primary function of the blood is to transport energy and materials throughout the body and distribute it as needed. So one of the things it transports is oxygen to body cells and carbon dioxide away from body cells. It delivers hormones from glands where they're produced to the target tissues. It absorbs nutrients from the digestive system, such as glucose and amino acids, brings them to the liver where they may be stored or to the body cells where they need to be used. And it takes the wastes from cellular metabolism and delivers them to the kidneys for processing and excretion. Homeostatic regulation occurs when the body's internal temperature gets too warm. The body must be able to rid itself of heat in order to maintain a constant internal temperature. So the body sends more blood to the skin from the muscles, and it dilates the arteries near our skin, allowing more heat to be lost through the skin. The greater the temperature differences, the more rapid the heat loss. So humans have about 4 to 6 liters of blood in their circulatory system, and it consists of plasma with various types of cells suspended in it. So about 55% of our total blood volume is plasma. 45% of the rest of it, the blood, is red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So when we look at plasma, if you take a blood donation, put it into a tube and spin it in a centrifuge, you'll be able to separate the parts based on weight. And plasma typically is this yellow, clear substance, and then the red blood cells are the rest. You can't typically see the white blood cell components. So plasma is about 55% of our blood volume. The cellular elements, the red and white blood cells and platelets, are about 45%. So plasma is about 90% water, with the rest being dissolved gases, electrolytes, nutrients, vitamins, minerals, waste products, and proteins. Plasma can be dehydrated and rehydrated to be administered to people at locations far away from where it was first donated. It can be given to people in shock to make up for missing blood volume without fear of rejection. So it doesn't matter what people's blood type are. Burn victims end up needing a lot of plasma because people lose a lot of water through burned tissue because it's moist. The skin isn't there to protect it anymore. And given to people who need massive immediate rehydration of their blood due to blood loss. So the formed portion of blood is the cellular components, red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. And they're made up by the bone marrow, predominantly in the ribs, sternum, skull, and vertebra. So when we look at blood proteins, we have 3 different categories. We have the albumins, which are produced by the liver. They establish the osmotic pressure, draw water from our body tissues into the circulatory system, maintaining our blood pressure. We have globulins, which help in the transport of materials. And we have fibrinogens, which are important in blood clotting. Looking specifically at our different types of blood cells, red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes, which means red cell, and they're the most numerous cells in the blood. You might have as many as 25 trillion in your body. Again, they have a very short lifespan because they have no cell nucleus. The primary function of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen to the organs and tissues throughout the body. So a hemocrit is going to be a count of your red blood cells. So a normal count is about 40% of the total blood volume will be red blood cells. Anemia means you have a lower amount of red blood cells. And polycythemia is a high amount of red blood cells. So mammalian red blood cells are biconcave, which means they're concave on both sides. So if you took a ball and kind of squished both sides, they're so specialized in their function that they don't have a nucleus or mitochondria, which means they aren't able to reproduce themselves, which is why they're reproduced in their bone marrow. So the primary role of red blood cells is to carry oxygen throughout the body, and that they have the pigment hemoglobin, which increases the ability to carry oxygen by more than 70 times. Without hemoglobin, your blood would only be able to carry enough oxygen to maintain life for about 4.5 seconds. So really nothing at all. Each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, which are made up of the heme group, which is what contains the iron to bind to the oxygen, and the globin group, which is the complex protein structure that the heme binds to. So the globin is on the blood, and then the heme is on the globin, and the iron in the heme is what binds to the oxygen. So the iron in hemoglobin chemically binds to the oxygen, creating that oxyhemoglobin compound. And the hemoglobin also picks up carbon dioxide to take it back to the lungs to exhale. When the iron of the heme group binds to the oxygen, we get that molecule oxyhemoglobin, which gives that blood a bright red color. Deoxygenated blood typically looks dark blue, purple, but if we ever cut ourselves, we only see oxygenated blood because it will immediately bind to the oxygen in the environment. Erythropoiesis is the process of making red blood cells. So because red blood cells have no nucleus, they're unable to reproduce. They start out as nucleated stem cells in the bone marrow and last about 3 to 4 months before they become brittle and destroyed. So they're constantly being regenerated. Dead red blood cells are brought to the liver to be recycled, and the iron from the hemoglobin is returned to the bone marrow to make new red blood cells. And the heme is turned into a product called bilirubin. So bilirubin is a yellow-brown compound that's responsible for the color of bile and feces because we excrete it. It can also be seen as the yellow residue after a bruise. And if you have an accumulation of bilirubin in your body, you have jaundice. So jaundice can be common occasionally in babies. Funnily enough, one of the ways to treat jaundice is to spend some time in sunlight because the UV will break down that bilirubin. So here's the breakdown of the red blood cells. So if we start at number 1, red blood cells die. They're absorbed by other cells in the body, known as phagocytes. The heme is broken down to the globulin and heme groups. The heme is then moved to the liver, where it is sent back to the bone marrow through number 7 to be used in making more red blood cells. Where number 9, the bilirubin is moved to the liver, to the small intestines, where it is then excreted through the kidneys or the bowels. So if the oxygen concentration of the blood gets too low, special receptors in the kidneys release a hormone called renal erythropoietic factor, which combines blood globulins with a hormone called erythropoietin to stimulate the blood to produce more red blood cells. So athletes have been known to abuse EPO. This was big, I think, around like 2000 in the Olympics and in things like cross-country skiing, where athletes would take EPO to artificially increase their amount of red blood cells in their body. So athletes, if they train at high altitude levels, will have a high level of red blood cells because the air up there has less pressure, which means you need more red blood cells to effectively transfer the same amount of oxygen through the body. So this increased amount of red blood cells allows the blood to carry more oxygen, deliver more energy, which allows this muscle cells to produce more energy. And unfortunately, a combination of dehydration from exercise coupled with the thicker blood could lead to problems such as clotting, stroke, and heart failure. But it's naturally increased EPO. It doesn't typically cause those problems. If you have an iron deficiency, hemoglobin or red blood cells, in deficiency in iron, hemoglobin, or red blood cells can decrease the amount of oxygen that's delivered to body tissues. So you typically have low energy and are very tired and lethargic. If a person loses more than 40% of their blood, the body cannot cope. So oxygen deficiency results in low energy levels, and you have some severe health consequences. And if you have low levels of red blood cells, you might have anemia. This can be caused by hemorrhage and blood loss or from a dietary iron deficiency. So moving on to white blood cells, these are also known as leukocytes, and they're important in fighting diseases and infections, and they only make up a total of about 1% of our blood volume and are outnumbered by red blood cells about 700 to 1. But if you're fighting an infection, the amount of leukocytes in your bodies can double. All leukocytes have a nucleus, and they appear colorless and can be divided into 3 different groups. The first is granulocytes, which includes Eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. Eosinophils and basophils release histamines, which cause the capillaries to dilate and allow white blood cells to move in and out of the capillaries into surrounding tissues. And this can be accompanied by swelling, which can be uncomfortable, and you would use an antihistamine to reduce. Neutrophils are phagocytes, and they engulf bacteria and foreign particles, much like amoeba, and destroy them with digestive enzymes. So they'll engulf them and then destroy them. Monocytes are phagocytes as well and can leave the bloodstream and become more specialized macrophages, which then engulf bacteria and then destroy it. Lymphocytes are white blood cells that are divided into two categories, B cells and T cells. This is part of our immune response. T cells recognize that there is an infection, and B cells produce antibodies. Antibodies then are proteins that are going to attach themselves to invaders to make themselves more recognizable to other immune cells, who then can be phagocytized and destroyed. So here we have another breakdown. So the leukocytes, or white blood cells, can be the granulocytes, monocytes, or lymphocytes, which then produce the B and T cells, which then produce antibodies. The third component of our blood is our platelets, or thrombocytes, and these are a very important part of our blood clotting process. Clotting is important because it prevents excessive blood loss after injury, bruises, cuts, scrapes, anything like that. Platelets, again, do not have a nucleus and are formed in the bone marrow cells. But when looking at the steps of blood clotting, first, a blood vessel is damaged, exposing its connective tissues layers, and the cells of that blood vessel release a substance which makes them sticky. Then platelets, which are just floating around in the plasma, begin to stick to those injured sticky sites. Platelets start to change shape and rupture, releasing a protein called thromboplastin, which combines with calcium ions in the blood to activate another protein called prothrombin. And prothrombin turns into thrombin. Thrombin is an enzyme that acts on a substance called fibrinogen, which is then converted into fibrin, which is an insoluble substance that turns into a sticky mesh, binding together to prevent blood cells from escaping, forming a clot, which then prevents foreign objects and bacteria from entering the body further and blood from getting out of the body. So here we can see that flow chart again. So damaged tissue and platelets release thromboplastin into the blood. So thromboplastin then combines with calcium to start the clotting process and forms prothrombin, which then turns into thrombin. Thrombin converts fibrinogen to fibrin, which makes this web-like sticky material that we can see all over the blood cells in that picture. This then forms a clot, which prevents more blood from leaving the body and bacteria and foreign particles from getting into the body. So blood clotting is essential for preserving life, but occasionally we can have some disorders that are associated with it. So thrombus is a blood clot that occurs within a blood vessel where we don't want it. So this can lead to the blood vessel getting blocked and tissue after the blockage dying due to lack of oxygen. A cerebral thrombosis, so blockage of a blood vessel in the brain, can cause a stroke, and a coronary thrombosis, so a blockage of the coronary artery in the heart, can cause a heart attack. If the clot dislodges, it becomes an embolus, which can be then an embolism can travel through your bloodstream and lodge in body organs. What causes these events are unknown, but it's thought that they can be linked to genetic abnormalities. So here we have an embolism, where a blood clot that travels within the body, and it can get lodged somewhere, causing a blood clot. So hemophilia is an inherited life-threatening disorder caused by insufficient clotting proteins in the blood. It's very rare in females because it's carried on the X chromosome. And so because females get 2 X chromosomes, we're generally protected from that disorder because we'll have one dysfunctional gene and one normal gene. People with hemophilia are constantly in danger of bleeding to death because even a small bruise could bleed out of control. Leukemia is cancer of the white blood cells. So it causes the white blood cells to be produced at an increased rate. So people with leukemia often have a high white blood count, but the leukocytes are immature, so they cannot fight off an infection. So the increased white blood cells also will take up space needed by red blood cells, which can lead to anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a hereditary blood disorder resulting from a mutation of the red blood cells, which causes them to have an abnormal shape. So they're shaped like a sickle cell, which is a knife that would be used to cut down crops. So these red blood cells become crescent-shaped. They have a difficulty passing through small blood vessels. So sickle cell anemia is common in areas where malaria is common because having one gene for sickle cell anemia, for some reason, protects individuals from dying from malaria. Having two normal genes makes individuals more susceptible to dying from malaria, where having two sickle cell genes usually means someone has sickle cell anemia, and without treatment, they'll often pass away. So just an interesting fact about where sickle cell anemia is more common in the world. So we can also have a disorder called lymphatic filariasis or elephantitis, which is a debilitating blood disease caused by nematode worms. So we have an inflammation due to worms. Larval worms circulate in the bloodstream, and adult worms live in the lymphatic vessels, which is what helps move fluid away from body tissues. And this is not a life-threatening condition, but it does cause extreme discomfort and swelling of the limbs and genitals because that's where our lymph nodes could be, damage to the kidneys and lymphatic system, impairment of the body's ability to fight infection, and general malaise. And again, transmitted by mosquitoes. So mosquitoes carry a lot of different blood disorders. So HIV AIDS is a blood-borne disease of the human immune system. So it's human-acquired immunodeficiency syndrome if you have AIDS. And this renders people highly vulnerable to life-threatening conditions like pneumonia and different types of cancers. It's most commonly transmitted in infected blood and bodily secretions. In Canada, most of the transmissions are through intravenous drug use, but unprotected sexual intercourse also can be a risk for HIV AIDS. Fortunately now, through modern treatment methods, if you ever get diagnosed with HIV, the antivirals that they have available to take can decrease your viral load so that there's almost no change in your life expectancy, and that you're at an incredibly low risk of passing it on to any possible sexual partner. So it's important to get tested for STIs because there are great treatments for them. Sepsis is an overwhelming and life-threatening bacterial infection. So often people will call this blood infections of the blood or body organs caused by bacteria that's entered the tissue through like wounds or incisions or cuts. And then we have a pus formation, and then that bacteria gets into the bloodstream, which could lead to a whole body infection and also possibly septic shock. Okay, so that was a breakdown of the structures in the blood. Catch you next time.